Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 430, February 29th, leap year, 1980, side 1. I mentioned the leap year because I thought maybe this was the opportunity for researchers to get one more extra day during the year to cross-file and put information away. We're always short of time, but you can turn it around and say that it's one more extra day of news that you have to compile and put away in a world that is spinning too fast. There's just too much news to cross-file and assimilate the way it should be done in order to come up with some of the answers to questions that are being asked today. I've been accused on radio talk shows and also on the tape sometimes of throwing out names too fast and giving too much information in one tape. I apologize in advance. I'm going to be guilty of that on this tape. If you don't know the names, you'll have to go to your newspapers and do your homework because there's so much news and there isn't an opportunity or chance to develop each story that would take a tape in itself. So I'm just going to zip around like a roller coaster and hope you catch part of the ride and understand what I'm saying. I was invited to speak at Santa Catalina School this last Tuesday evening, and when one of the students invited me there, I was hesitant because 2 years ago when I was there, the students were very enthusiastic and interested and anxious to learn about history. And last year, they seemed to be getting into that complacency and apathy with political problems and weren't too interested. So when I was invited this year, I felt that maybe it wasn't even worth the effort, although I shouldn't feel that way because whenever you reach young people like that, this is a high school for girls, college preparatory, private school, Catholic school in the area. And when you're reaching young people, you just never know what seeds are being planted for people to become curious and ask questions when they get older. And the young woman who invited me asked me to come, and I expressed my feelings about the way the students were going. And she said, oh no, from 2 years ago when you were there, we started a social studies discussion group, and we read the newspapers and books, and we're trying to read information in addition to our regular studies and keep up with these matters. So with that, I said, of course, then I'll come. And this young lady is going to Georgetown University next year and wants to go into the State Department and is very interested in the book list that I have and the research and the radio shows I do here. And the students this year, particularly the war hangover and the draft and the possibility they're going into the Army and the abscam and so much corruption, they were very enthusiastic. And I think it's important to reach to these people. Of course, the theme that I was talking about with them was on how to read the newspaper and how to think for yourself. As soon as they graduate, most of these are seniors, they were juniors and seniors, throw off just about everything your parent, your priest, your teacher, minister, congressman has told you, and go out and figure it out for yourself, because even though they may mean well, they haven't figured out a lot of things that the young people today are going to have to figure out. And I gave them different newspaper articles, the same article in the Washington Post that was in the San Francisco Chronicle, and showed the difference in the parts that were deleted, or Jack Anderson article on the Monterey Peninsula in the Herald that's deleted from the San Francisco Chronicle or the Washington Post, and show them how even when you're taking one newspaper, a lot is deleted. And then we did quickly a summary of from the John Kennedy assassination up through the Jonestown massacre, and I emphasized how important it was that these people don't turn their backs on these deaths and don't say, well, that Kennedy case was 16 years ago and they will never find the answers, or Jonestown was a bunch of black people, mostly black, who looked for an answer to life, an easy out, and went down to Guyana. And I emphasized that there were 120 white brainwashed assassins out on the streets from Jonestown, that they were going to have to live with those kinds of people that were brainwashed killers, and that this had been testified. A man named George Berdes had testified before Congress, and it was reported last May in the newspaper that there were from Jonestown. This basketball squad probably is part of it, and the people that turned these bodies upside down and then left the nurse and the people that turned them and took the boat to Barbados and escaped and went over to Venezuela, that there were these trained assassins that were brainwashed. There were a white entourage that could run places like Dachau and Auschwitz, and that they shouldn't pretend later when fascism comes that they didn't know, because I gave them newspaper articles to show how it was right there in the newspaper. The meeting was at 7:30 at night, and it went on till around 10:30, quarter of 11. But by the time I got from John Kennedy to Jonestown, just before we took questions, the history teacher was questioning me, the only teacher, faculty person in the room, with these young people, and taking a lot of notes and questioning how could the United States have gone in with troops and saved those people. We would be breaking the law. And we had a dialogue, and I was really trying to tell him off, not in a very nice way. And I guess at the exact moment that we were talking about that, the Mills were murdered up in the Bay Area in San Francisco. Jeannie and Al Mills, who said on national television, who said on the radio, who published a book on Jonestown, that they were part of a hit list that would be murdered. And just at the time that I was speaking to these young people, at the exact moment about the hit squad, the Mills were murdered in the Bay Area. Now, because I've done so many tapes on Jonestown, I'm going to get back to the Mills in a few minutes. I just want to say that I am going to get to that, but I want to bring up a few other deaths and matters before we get to them, because I don't want to lose them. The way the news is coming out, there's too much information. So I want to cover briefly a few quick stories so that you get a hold of them. And of course, I'm going back to the Charles Krause article in Colonial Dignidad, the part that I left off last week, and do some more about this story that broke in the Washington Post last week that pertains also to Jonestown and these trained assassins and this Gestapo that's out on the loose. This is the 10th anniversary of the Isla Vista riots in Santa Barbara. That's when the students at the University of California had a curfew put on them at the time of the anti-war movement during the Cambodia bombings and the Kent State massacres, and the 1,000 faculty and students and others were put on this curfew. A non-violent demonstration was placed. They refused to obey. Hundreds of people were beaten and tear-gassed, and 600 were arrested. And then later, 11 students who were charged with burning the Bank of America proved conclusively in court that they were not involved. This was a counterintelligence event staged in California during the anti-war movement. Now, Ronald Reagan was governor of California at the time, and I bring up the 10th anniversary of Reagan because, 10th anniversary of Isla Vista and Reagan's being governor, because at the time of this Isla Vista occurrence, Ronald Reagan said, with a violent confrontation from the sheriff's department, which later turned out to do all the brutality. It was Sheriff Peter Pitch's department, the same man that created the Manson family and was responsible for the death of Sharon Tate and LaBiancas and everybody in the Tate home. The sheriff's department, Peter Pitch's of Los Angeles, California. Well, he set up the confrontations up in Isla Vista, and Ronald Reagan, the governor, was quoted as saying, "If it's to be a bloodbath, let it be." And with that, the sheriff's department went crazy, and as I say, they arrested 600 people, and many of them were beat up and hurt. It was a terrible tragedy for a nonviolent demonstration. It was Ronald Reagan's answer to somebody like Mahatma Gandhi, who wanted and taught nonviolence in India, and he said, "Bring on the bloodbath." That's the man that won the New Hampshire primaries this week. Mr. George Bush, who isn't out of the running yet because Reagan's an old man and could get an MK Ultra treatment or a stroke or trip over a shoelace, and neither one of them is good. I'm not pushing for either of these dogs. George Bush had a press conference this last week, a gathering in Florida, of course, and he told them the United States must recognize it cannot always impose its morality on other countries. We're a moral country, he said, and we have to deal with the world as it is. And if we press our friends for change and change and change so much faster than their system can take, we sometimes wake up with friends replaced that are less good, something worse in terms of human rights. George Bush was director of the Central Intelligence Agency when agents from Chile, Colonial Dignidad, working with Operation Condor that set up headquarters in Florida, the same state that he's talking to about morality, were ordered to kill Orlando Letelier and Sandra Moffit in Washington, D.C., and they've done other murders in the United States. These assassination teams are rampant, and what he calls not imposing our morality means we can't tell them to stop killing. As head of the CIA, he worked closely with Mr. Somoza from Nicaragua. Just this week, a trial is going on of Anastasia Somoza's National Guard in Nicaragua. There's a group of people that haven't been murdered. There's 7,800 alleged war criminals that were part of Somoza's team, and one man has offered to testify in return for some special treatment before this tribunal that's taking place. Somoza is now down in Paraguay with Mengele and Stroessner and Bormann and the other Nazi gang. He's fled down there. But at this trial, this former guardsman, his name is Gerardo Leiva, he's 30 years old, he was telling about the crimes that Somoza did, and Somoza graduated from the United States West Point, and all of his police were trained by the United States CIA in Panama and in the United States for torture. He goes on to say that they used a Korean mercenary they brought over among some of the things that they did, who tortured peasants. After they tortured peasants, they took the bodies of the peasants that were tortured, and they killed them, and they fried them, and then they fed them to their dogs. I'm reading a United Press story. The Korean, one of them was named Chino. He drove nails through the noses of the peasants. He tortured at the National Guard command post 210 miles north of Managua. The former officers are still in prison, but he testified about them. He said peasants were forced to dig trenches that became their mass graves and then shot them to death when they were finished digging. If it looks like a Nazi, if it's directed by a Nazi, if it acts like a Nazi and is smelt by a Nazi, it's not neo-Nazi. Somoza and Bush and Colonia Dignidad and the whole killer team have worked together hand in glove. Going back to the testimony of this man in Nicaragua, he said other forms of torture on peasants included rape, studded iron balls that swung against victims, electric shock to the genitals, and carving out chunks of flesh of live victims. Bedina said men, women, and children and peasants were tied up blindfolded and thrown from helicopters. That's a trick that our William Colby did in Southeast Asia. That was the Phoenix program, to take people and throw them out of American-made Bell-used aircraft, Textron, helicopters, to throw people out, whole families, blindfolded out of helicopters. That's the testimony on Nicaragua, and this is the statement, the campaign statement of George Bush: leave them alone, it's their morality, and we can't press our friends to change. Another dog who works with that team that I mentioned briefly as having been arrested in the, or named, he's going to be arrested in the Abscam scandal, and I want to do some of that on the other side of this tape, is Representative Murphy. And I mentioned on a tape several weeks ago that Murphy was a member of the Pahlavi Foundation with the Shah of Iran and got him tax-deductible property in New York City, and worked closely with the Korea Gate officials and with Somoza. Went to West Point, an undergrad school, prep school with Somoza before Somoza went down to Nicaragua. And up through the time that Somoza left, Murphy was with him when he left. Murphy was interviewed last June when there was an uprising there, and when ABC TV photographed Bill Stewart, a newspaper reporter. He was murdered by the Somoza guardsmen in Managua. And Representative Murphy's quotation was, Stewart shouldn't have been there in the first place. And Murphy was just trying to cover up the murder. He made it justifiable, and that if you're in the wrong place, then you're going to be shot. The news people shouldn't even be covering what's going on in Nicaragua. That's an American newspaper man. Murray Kempton, quotation from the Washington Post, described Murphy as more susceptible to the attractions of foreign tyrants than Oscar Wilde ever was to bellboys. That is Representative Murphy, John Murphy, who has been caught up in the Abscam net, close links to Chemisol Corporation in New York City, which could be a dummy front. They're investigating that as a source for his becoming suddenly wealthy, ties to Korea, the Shah of Iran, and Nicaragua. Murphy's had a bad year. All of his friends seem to have been gone, and now he's arrested. There is some justice, I suppose, after all. Last week I talked on the tape about a trial going on in Philadelphia of Francis J. Sheeran, a leader of the Teamsters Union, who had been charged by a government informant and a Teamster man that worked with the Teamsters of having set up 4 murders, 2 murders specifically, 4 attempted murders, 2 arsons, and embezzlement of Teamsters funds. The case was going on in Philadelphia, and the man who was whistling or singing on these stories, Charles Allen, mentioned giving money, the Teamsters, to John Mitchell, and this also involved murders in the Southwest of high-up officials that were part of the Teamster organization. Well, I have to inform you this week that Mr. Francis Sheeran has been acquitted of all charges. The next step is that the informer who blew the whistle, Charles Allen's life insurance isn't worth a wooden nickel. In a few more weeks or a year, you'll see that Charles Allen was dead, but the man who specifically set up testified against him, and a trial was conducted in Philadelphia, which I'll go into later. The policeman in charge of the Abscam investigation in New York said he worked in Philadelphia a few years and it was a cesspool. He went on to New York to do some interesting cases, such as indicting Michael Sindona, whose trial is going on now, and Mr. Scotto, friends of the White House, and Jimmy Carter, both men linked to the Vatican money, and he also was the chief New York investigator to meet the Jonestown defendants when they came in, and then later all the FBI papers were destroyed. Some get caught and some get away. We'll do more about that, but there's interesting links of the Jonestown defendants to the Vatican story, to the Scotto, the organized crime, the Gambino family, the Abscam, the gun running you see, and the narcotics traffic down in Jonestown too. It will all come together in our lifetime, but I just want to say that Francis Sheehan has been acquitted of the 2 murders, the 4 murder attempts, the extortion, the whole thing, out free, ready to work again. There's a very important trial going on in Los Angeles, particularly in lieu of the FBI trying to get a handle on organized crime. This has to do with crime families up in San Jose. A murder took place October the 11th, 1977. Peter Catelli was murdered, and his father was shot and left for dead, survived, and he is attempting to prosecute the heads of the mozzarella cheese, the organized crime under the guise of a cheese factory up in the Bay Area. The main defendant in the case, Salvatore Marina, who is charged with shooting both the fatal shot of Peter, who died, and of his father, was taken out of the case, separated from the other defendants this week because 2 of the attorneys are sick. One, James Marks, the younger attorney, the attorney for Marino, said that he is suffering congestive heart failure and he has to take a rest. And then another attorney, Frank Glenn, second attorney, said that he can't take over the case because he's had 2 heart attacks suffered since last summer. So the main defendant in these murder and attempted murder charges, and they do go to the highest echelons of organized crime throughout California or the United States, or linking even abroad. As the cases got going and their arrests made, they took 2 attorneys who evidently have had heart seizures or attacks since the arrest, and now the one defendant has been separated because of these cases. I bring this up because there's so much of these attorneys either being murdered or getting heart disease, and the case is put off or dropped, or it's a diversionary. In this case, both attorneys are suffering from heart disease at this time. I mentioned last week the Michael Mickey Zaffaroni, who dropped dead of a heart attack just when the FBI agents were coming to him on a multi-billion-dollar porno industry. Another primary witness that dropped dead. I mentioned him on the tape last week. Jack Anderson, February 26, 1980, has a long article about Zaffaroni, who owns a place in Washington, D.C. called the Playhouse and the Pussycat Theater in New York City, which is a cover of the Mafia's main distribution of pornographic movie, and it's linked. Zaffaroni is a captain in the Banana Mafia family. Now, the case in California that I just mentioned is linked to the Banana family, too, the murders and the cheese factory out in San Jose, California. You see, the FBI is closing in, and the Abscam story is not a fake. It is not something to just get Democrats. This is very important, and that's why I want to bring out these cases, even if I don't get to all the Abscam now, because these witnesses are dying like mad. This particular Zaffaroni was wanted for shakedowns, extortion, and so forth, and they describe his business as being the third largest income maker for La Cosa Nostra. First there's gambling, then there's narcotics, and there's pornography. Well, you may say, if pornography is over on Broadway in San Francisco or on 42nd Street in New York, and I don't want to see a movie, that's their business. Pornography isn't just that. It's kidnapping women. There's a case in Los Angeles where 30, 40, 50 women have been discovered to be dead in the pornographic racket. It's child pornography, photographing 3- and 4-year-olds, and child prostitution of boys and women, and deaths that accompany it, and extortions and blackmail, and the promotion of human lives. This is what was going on in Panama and Havana before Fidel Castro kicked the whole gang out. But pornography isn't a question of taste of two adults making a decision to see a movie. Pornography is rearrangement of lives over and over again. Jack Anderson mentions that Deep Throat, a fairly innocent pornographic movie, made $50 million last year. I just saw a large article on Linda Lovelace, and she lives on welfare, so the United States are paying taxes to support her and her husband and her child. She can't seem to earn a living, and she's living in some kind of suburb. A long article about her. She's living on welfare, and you and I pay for her, and they've made $50 million so far, and they'll pull in another $50 million on the picture. It is literally slavery, exploitation, and they don't even give back a fair shake to the people who make it for them. But this feeds organized crime to bring in more drugs, to bring in more crime, to pay off more police, more congressmen, more justices of the Supreme Court, going right up to like Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was discovered by Murray Chotiner with his links to organized crime. So just as the FBI closing in, and Zaffaroni, one of the king men, he too has a heart attack. There was a murder in Beverly Hills last May 23rd, 1979, and it had to do with a woman who was on the jury hearing the Iranian riots or the possible deportation of Iranians at the time that the Shah of Iran's sister was in Beverly Hills. And this woman was Cotsen, Mrs. Cotsen, C-O-T-S-E-N, was on the jury, grand jury, or the Beverly Hills inquiry into this matter, and somebody came in her home wearing a skiing mask and killed her and killed their son and a guest in the home also. The wonderful Beverly Hills police that's worked with Jack Agers and the drug connections and the Hollywood drug connections and kept them very well protected all these years. The Beverly Hills police went over to Switzerland to interview a man, and just hours before he was being interviewed by the Beverly Hills police, he, in quotes, apparently killed himself. That's the way Lee Harvey Oswald's closest friend, George DeMorenchild, hours before the House Select Committee was to see him in Florida, he apparently killed himself, never mind all the discrepancies. Well, the police chief, Lee Tracy, went over to Switzerland, and the murder was in May 26th. The man's been dead since October 15th, 1979, and now the case is closed. The Associated Press says Belgian blamed for Beverly Hills slaying. The police say the business rival killed a man's family. Another article this week, dead man accused in 3 Beverly Hills slayings. Well, what else is new? A Belgian businessman named Eric Arnie Tall, alone, according to the police reports, after he was dead, killed his longtime rival's wife and child, and then killed himself. And it was a pharmaceutical company that they worked for. Just visualize this, that a drug company, a pharmaceutical company out of Belgium and Switzerland, that a man is competing with Lloyd Cotsen and his lawsuits involved for the drug company. So instead of killing his competitor, he kills the wife and the son and a friend in the house, and then he kills himself, which leaves the business open for his competitor. It doesn't explain why he would kill the wife and leave. Why didn't he just kill the man who had the lawsuit against him? So the way it reads, dead man is accused in Beverly Hills slayings. That's the easiest thing to do, and you get these instant apparent heart attacks, apparent shootings, apparent suicides, just when the case is getting hot. And again, on the trail of the Mills family, we'll get to that soon, just at the time that Leo Ryan has a press conference forcing Congress to go into the killings at Guyana because the CIA had a report that is dated that they had an agent at the airport when Leo Ryan was killed. Then two of the primary witnesses, Al and Jeannie Mill, that set up Jonestown with Tim Stone, were wiped out. No suspects. No, son didn't hear anything. Nobody heard anything. Their brains were blown. Their daughter, bullets in her brain. But getting back to the Beverly Hills man, dead man accused because he's a longtime rival in a competitive pharmaceutical world at a time when pharmacies, drug companies, and the scam is operating and closing in nationally and internationally. That's the way the Beverly Hills police work, and I had to bring this to your attention. I save all these articles on these various, in quotes, unsolved murders, and I'm always glad to see that they're finally solved and that the dead man apparently did it. It's so neat and tidy, and I can put that under a completed file now. Completed, my eye. It'll be open for lots of years to come, and it will reappear again. Talking about reappearing, one of my favorite stories broke in the Salinas, California, just Wednesday night. It isn't in any papers that we have around here yet. I did shows on KLRB. I might have been on tapes. I have to look back at the date. But I mentioned when the Glomar Explorer was built that it was built specifically by the School of Oceanography and Howard Hughes Company, CIA, to get stolen jewels that were taken on a Japanese ship, disguised as a Red Cross hospital ship that was sunk outside of Hong Kong and China during World War II, that took the crown jewels of the Tsar's family from Harbin. The jewels were sent to Harbin and then were picked up in Manchuria by Japan, and at the time they thought Russia was going to come into Japan at the end of the war, before we dropped the atomic bomb to quickly end the war. These jewels were taken on a hospital ship and dumped. Now, that ship is being raised by China. It was in the paper last night, and I don't have all the details. A friend who lives in Salinas told me about it. The ship jewels are being brought up. They are equal to billions of dollars, and these very easily could prove that that sabotage Red Cross ship was done purposely. And by allowing Red China, after we recognized Red China and made a deal with them about rearming them, we may be allowing Red China to bring the money in, and that's a payment for them to go to war against Russia with us. Turn the ship over to them instead of giving them cash. And the School of Oceanography in San Diego, run by Charles Lindbergh's son and other scientists, is in on the bringing up of the jewels, but the jewels will belong to China, which is a payment of billions and billions. There's several billions of dollars. I don't have all the figures of star sapphires, gold, diamond, and jewels. And this is what I believe are the Tsar's jewels and the wealth of Russia that could be taken to Manchuria, to Harbin, picked up by Japan, taken to China, that just last night broke in the news. And as I say, I file these articles way away, and years later the stories break. I'll have more on that for you next week, but I want to give an example of how I have endless patience, and you wait 2, 3, 5, 10, 12, 16 years, it fits together. And that's the fun of doing the research. Besides accounting all these horrible murders of witnesses, it's fun to do the research. Another quick murder at the time of Abscam that may or may not have something to do with it, I think it does, is an antique dealer, a former actor, Richard Coleman on 77th Street, who collected million-dollar paintings. He had a place called Possessions of Prominence, where artwork of millions of dollars was not kept in public galleries for sale, and it was sold by special distribution. It'd be a wonderful way to unload stolen art that the Vatican and the Nazis had and stored away. It was to take it to private art dealers in private homes. And just at the time that the art story is breaking with Abscam, a Titian valued $2 million was in this home, and there's an inventory of art that's just being put together, multi-million-dollar collection of art, and two men were murdered. They say the first story said they were robbed. The second said they weren't robbed. But the point is that in these private apartments in New York City, there's millions of dollars of art objects that siphon through. People don't know the origins, where they came from, or where they're going, while some people are trying to claim their family art treasures that were taken from them 30 years ago and have never been found. These murders are interesting because, again, they come just at a time that Abscam and the story that I did on William Taub with the missing oil paintings from the Vatican, I did a tape on that, and then the next week the Abscam story break with missing paintings, and the Abscam story was a Rubens, the story of William Taub was a Rubens, and now this man who was murdered, and his friend have millions of dollars in private apartment in New York City where people can view everything is there. There is for sale except a chair. Very convenient place to sell. You don't have to catalog it, have public see it. Just a handful of select people can take it and put it away. And of course, these Arab art collectors, some disguised as Abscam and other real ones, can just take that and salt it all away in Saudi Arabia or other places until the Holocaust or the next war is over, and then surface with these valuable paintings. They have the cash and the means, and there's a traffic of these paintings that are high items. And so just last week, the art dealer and his buddy were killed. Another famous murder, Don Bolles, the reporter. I mentioned his name briefly last week on the tapes. He lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and he was exposing land frauds of Hughes and organized crime in the state of Arizona, the Hughes organization, organized crime. On the other side of this tape, before we get to Jonestown and Abscam and some other matters, I do want to briefly mention 3 other deaths that were in the news this week, and one of them is the release of 2 men, Max Dunlap and James Robeson, from charges of murder of Don Bolles. They were convicted, and now they've been cleared. The conviction's been reversed in that case. And what else is new? We'll do more on the other side. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape 430, February 29th, 1980, and it's side 2. While I'm running down this litany of deaths all around us in the news, I wonder if any of you saw the Grammy Awards this week. I love the modern pop music, country, western, and so forth, and they had a lot of it. It was really good. And I was really surprised that among the classical music awards, they nominated an album of Vladimir Horowitz and some compositions of Brahms and Bartok. But among the classical nominations this year was Stephen Sondheim's Sweeney Todd. And that thrilled me. It won many Tony Awards. It's the most magnificent play I've seen in years and years. And when it leaves Broadway as so-called light opera, it is grand opera. It's going to be part of the New York not the New York Opera Company, not the Metropolitan, the New York Opera Company. But Sweeney Todd was nominated. Stephen Sondheim's music is fantastic, and I played part of Pacific Overture a little bit on some of the tapes. I haven't done Sweeney for you. But Sweeney is the demon barber of Fleet Street who cuts throats for vengeance. He's avenging what he thinks was the death of his wife and the kidnapping of his daughter by the judge. And he makes comments that the judges, the finest people, are involved in these crimes. I wrote Stephen Sondheim a letter and reminded him, in case he didn't know, of the roles of Earl Warren through his life and the scandals and so forth that preceded his great raise to fame to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And in the opera, Sweeney looks at the audience when he is so filled with anger and vengeance and sings an aria song, "Don't judge me. There is murder in you. You are Sweeney Todd's too. Don't sit there and look at me." I'm just paraphrasing what he says, but it's in all of us. The potential is there in all of us. It's in the Ronald Reagans who say, "Let there be blood." It's in the George Bushes that says we shouldn't impose our morality, which was what the Vatican said to Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, and the terrible goon squads that were carrying heads of human beings on sticks around the streets. The demonstrations of violence everywhere over the continent and now over every piece of earth and planet Earth, as blood is spilling. These candidates say, bring it on, let there be blood, and let us not impose morality. That's what Sondheim was saying in Sweeney Todd, loud and clear. and so I was very happy that he was nominated in 2 different categories, and this was for the classical music categories, and that's where he belongs, elevated, and there's a great message in Sweeney Todd. And unfortunately, there's too much of Sweeney in a lot of people, and there's too many payoffs of looking the other way, the justices, the Supreme Court, and the judges. And that's why I mentioned the judges. In this case, the conviction was reversed in the slaying of Don Bolles. Now, these convictions were reversed again just at a time when abscam is breaking. Abscam, or BRILAB, bribery and labor, began with cases in Phoenix, Arizona, where this agent was involved, and we'll be doing more of this on other tapes. And then he decided to work for the federal government and tipped them off to characters like Carlos Marcello and organized crime and the biggies around the country. But it began in Phoenix, Arizona. It was in Phoenix where Don Bolles was investigating organized crime. These 2 men were sentenced to death for the slaying of Bolles. He was killed in June 1976. But Dunlap and Robinson claimed that their trials were unfair, that they've got this all reversed now, that if you give a weak prosecution and you don't have a fair trial, then the Supreme Court or the upper courts can throw it out. And the defense attorneys were trying to show that they had an unfair trial. The prosecution made errors in the trial, which may be easy if the prosecution works with a syndicate. It's very easy to weakly prosecute 2 people that know so much about you and may have even gotten you into office in the first place. So right now, a new trial has been ordered, but Max Dunlap and James Robeson have had the cases reversed just at a time when organized crime and the FBI are going to be tangling each other. These 2 dogs had a reversal in those decisions. Some deaths are loud and clear and make the headlines, and some just creep like little pussy willows or little cat paws of the morning dew. You hardly hear a thing about it. A death last week of Joseph Collinson, February 23rd, New York Times. I bring it up to you because I don't see it in the other papers. Many things that are in all my papers I avoid putting on the tapes. If I find them in 1 out of 20 papers, I call your attention to them and ask you if you've seen them. Do you know the name Joseph B. Collinson? He took over from G. William Miller, Textron chairman. New York Times said Joseph Collinson inherited chairmanship of Textron and a federal investigation into the alleged corporate payoffs from G. William Miller. He died, in quotes, of an apparent heart attack last week. What would you know? Just at the time that the Congress is investigating Mr. Miller, going into it, and not enough of them are pressing, but it's been suggested they get a special investigator. And here's the head of Textron, a Bell helicopter with 2 of his agents sitting as hostages in Iran, and cross links to the Shah of Iran and other military dictatorships and payoffs and perjury under oath. William Proxmire is pushing this point. It's important enough to bring up the presidential candidates. Why, Mr. Collinson was 65 years old. He was named chairman in March 78 by President Jimmy Carter when Mr. Miller became chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and now he's secretary of our Treasury. Mr. Collinson was vice president of Textron since 1959 when it grew to a $3.4 billion firm. It was $308 million up to $3.4 billion. In quotes, Joe's death is a tremendous shock to us and to those people at Textron, and said Robert B. Strauss, who replaced Straetz, who replaced Collinson as chairman. Now, I think at the time that the Texas-based Bell Helicopter Division, Bell Helicopters, radio, television outlets, manufacturing terms of electronic equipment for the Shah, this corporation is suggested to be in criminal activities, to go to a court that should be investigated. Our Secretary of the Treasury should resign. At this time, this man drops dead of what they say an important apparent heart attack. The man who would have known where the money passed when Mr. Miller says he didn't know where $5.4 million went, quietly died last week, and I didn't see any of the paper. If you did, send me the articles. And finally, one more death before we go to Jonestown and Abscam. Mr. E.C. Jagerman died. He was formerly from the Security Exchange Commission, an aide there. Do you know that name? That also was in the New York Times. The New York Times is great for obituaries. If you want to know what's going on in Lebanon or who's being killed and their biographies later, just tear out your obituary page of the New York Times and save them for 365 days and you can write a book, okay? I mean, they're really great to pull out. Also, the Washington Post. Edward C. Jagerman won a reputation for toughness for 3 decades at the Security Exchange Commission. He died in New York City this week, again, apparently of a heart attack. I don't know whether they do autopsies on these people or not, and most of the mortuaries are run by the mafia. Apparently, again, from a heart attack. That means he probably didn't even have a heart disease. He was a top student at Yale and law school, and he joined the staff of the Security Exchange Commission. He was put on there by the chairman, William Douglas, who went on to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Douglas's career was also smarred with links to organized crime and Dorfman and Las Vegas connections. That was always carefully concealed, even after his death. Obituaries just had a little bit mention of William Douglas's association to organized crime. He was put on the Security Exchange Commission. Then the scandals begin. They have a little bit. Mr. Jagerman capped his government career with Texas Gulf sulfur case. He flew to Canada for an investigation that was a landmark decision. Some officers were violating the law by trading in the company's shares after a mineral discovery was made and before it was made public. Shortly before he joined a brokerage firm in 1968, it was forced to dissolve when the regulatory agencies accused it of various violations. And one of its principals, Mr. Jagerman, was among those held responsible for the violations of this firm. Then he faced an action brought by the Security Exchange Commission that he had served with distinction. He fought the charges. The Security Exchange Commission case had never been resolved. We're talking about stolen security and stolen arts now. And this new abscon has been going for 2 years, and he was involved in a case where he was never found guilty because they never prosecute high-up white-collar criminals or graduates of Yale that are put in the Security Exchange by a justice of the Supreme Court. The New York Times says the case was never resolved. He was never found guilty, and there was a trial on separate charges that was filed in the state of New York, but several Wall Street figures testified for him, including Ralph Saul, former SEC official and former president of the American Stock Exchange, now chairman of the INA Corporation, and Paul Windles, another SEC official, a partner of Windles, Marks, Davies, Ives, a New York law firm. So his company, the brokerage firm that he was with, was dissolved, and he was never charged. Then he was involved with other problems with the SEC. He was never found guilty. He was never going to trial. He never went to trial. Prominent people from SEC and from the stock market, the American Stock Exchange, went to bat for him, and he died from an apparent heart attack just at the time that securities and financial mishandling of very high prominent people are possibly going to be caught in a web. He died last week also. I love these apparent heart attacks. Whenever there's not a witness to a primary case, when it's some unimportant schmo, nobody's unimportant, I don't mean that, but when it's an ordinary story written up in the newspaper is not something to be investigated. They pinpoint the disease right down to the artery or the vessel and so forth. But when these people are involved in crimes that aren't prosecuted or they're about to go to prosecution or they're being investigated, they all have a disease that really should be cataloged apparent heart disease. That's a special kind of disease that never is investigated any further. Nelson Rockefeller had one of those apparent heart diseases also. Joe Holsinger, the aide to Leo Ryan, was testifying in Washington, D.C., before committees on Guyana, that the CIA supported Ms. Prime Minister Forbes Burnham, that Jim Jones was in on a CIA operation that could have been smuggling arms to Jonestown. He asked whether the U.S. government was aware that Jim Jones was smuggling these weapons. And Leo Ryan's death, Joe Holsinger claimed, was allowed, that Ryan was set up for murder by the CIA because they didn't want to blow the CIA connections between Mr. Burnham and Jim Jones. Now, that's pretty heavy because Jim Jones said, my mind was controlled by the CIA, and then 923 people had to be murdered when Leo Ryan went down there, and 120 of his assassins are out loose at the present time. Obviously, those assassins are out to kill those people who know about the Central Intelligence Agency connections. And just 1 week after this statement. This was February 21st, Thursday, 1980, the story broke, but he was testifying this last week, Joe Holsinger and also Jackie Spears, about the CIA having documents. They had a report from the scene of the crime to the White House that Leo Ryan was murdered. Now, I saw the CIA man there. I saw it at the time and mentioned it probably going back to my tapes on Jonestown. They sat in a Jeep, 2 men sat in a Jeep and drove away, a congressman visiting Guyana, and members of the press and people departing were gunned down, left for dead. The large number of them, many were dead, others were wounded, and a Jeep was at the airport, and you saw photographs of Jonestown. The Jeep drove away. Now, that Jeep reported to the Central Intelligence Agency. How did I know then that that Jeep was involved with the CIA? Because in any country, if the men worked at the airport, the natural instinct would be to run up and help the people that were wounded. And when you run away from them at an airfield that is privately controlled by Jim Jones and the Central Intelligence Agency, you have to go back and report to somebody, yes, they're dead. And then the orders begin, back in Jonestown, begin to kill all the people. Nobody ever talked about who drove those Jeeps, who was at the airport. And I also, with my psychic eyes, could see those Jeeps, that Jeep pulled down the road from Port Katuma to the back roads, and I believe it picked up Mark Lane and Charles Gary and then got them back to Georgetown. That's how I think they got back and survived. I think they were in the custody and protection because of their shenanigans. Mark Lane had to be down there when Jim Jones and the other men fell down because he was the official biographer for all this that was going to come down, and they knew it was going to come down. He even suggested, Charles Krause, that people would be sedated in their food that day, and of course their resistance could be lowered to whatever happened to them. Later reports claim and said the people weren't drugged. It's hard to tell after they're dead for 4 days and rotted and the flesh has gone off their bones what was in their bellies when they were served their lunch. I think it's impossible. They didn't even do autopsies of those people when they got them back 4 days later to see what was in their stomachs besides cyanide. But the CIA report has somebody there, and I know it was in that Jeep, and that they announced, yeah, they're dead, let's kill all the others, because it was a CIA operation. But why did they have to kill those people? Because they were mental experiments, they were zombies, robots, they were being tested, there were electrodes on the children, they were in the process of all kinds of experimentation, and if any of them came back to the United States, all of them would have to be killed because of the state of mind that they're in. 17 of them were met by a CIA agent in New York City. Others are under the control of the CIA. Now, the Mills family, we'll go into the Mills family death, but they just died days later. The story of Joe Holsinger testifying in Washington, D.C. about the CIA operation of Jim Jones, and Prime Minister Burnham was testimony in Congress this last week and put in the newspaper Thursday, February 21st, 1980, that's Thursday, and then the Mills family was killed on Tuesday, and they would be a very important part of the story of the links of the CIA Jones to CIA Burnham. Incidentally, the border of Guyana, Suriname, was overthrown with a military coup this week, and as I said last week, the 11,000 Laotians, illiterate Laotians who don't speak Spanish or English, are going to be flown down to Dutch Guyana, where they can continue the medical experiments, and as I said in the paper, it's going to be a private school, a private hospital, and they can be used for goon squads to kill other people. They're trained killers that work for the Central Intelligence Agency in Southeast Asia, and they can be programmed to be put to work through all of South America. This is a pleasant story. It's really awful. But you have these tapes, and you can play them over and over and let it sink in what I'm saying, and then compare the news in the next few years, and you judge whether I was right or wrong. I called Joe Holsinger, the man who had testified in Washington, who was the aide to Leo Ryan. He didn't know that Larry Layton's father was the head of biological and chemical warfare at Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. Larry Layton's going to trial in April this year down in Georgetown. It's a year and a half. They have a very swift system of justice down there. He'll probably be such a zombie by then that it'll be difficult to put him on trial after a year and a half down there. but I talked to Holsinger and sent him a package of lists of my various tapes on Jonestown, the inserts and sheets that go with it, the articles on colonial dignidad and the medical experimentations in Chile, and told him that the links of the CIA and Burnham were so sinister that the reason Leo Ryan was killed wasn't just because he might blow the CIA connections, but because the state of condition of those people and the experimentations that they were in, that they couldn't afford to release those people or have interviews and allow them to come home. And everyone who is home lives under threat of death. Well, Al and Jeannie Mills were killed, and the early story is hit squad theory in 2 killings. That's in one newspaper out here. Another, of course, the San Francisco Chronicle, mystery of the slain cult critics, motives lacking. The motives aren't lacking. Jackie Spears and various people, Joe Holsinger and others, particularly families of the Jonestown people, are pressing for the investigation of the role of the State Department, the FBI that destroyed all of their papers on Jonestown, and the Central Intelligence Agency, and our relationships to Burnham down in Guyana. The motive for killing these people is very obvious if you've studied the case. Of course, the newspaper accounts don't tell you very much about it. And the story of the details of the killings, they were shot in their home, 2 of them in the house, and their daughter was also shot. The son, Eddie Mills, was watching television. He said he didn't hear anything. The newspaper has said that it's possible that they used silencers. Of course, you know that Mitchell Werbell that worked with the Florida teams that were involved in the Letelier shooting, in massacres all over the world, of assassination teams, who's been linked to Frank Turple, who also trains the goon squads of the National Labor Party, this Mitchell Werbell, who has made silencers his expertise, who says that he manufactures them for the State Department, could very easily have made the silencer here, because when his name came up with the Frank Turple case, and we had it on the tapes, he said, I only do it with permission of the State Department. If the State Department sent Leo Ron and the others down there and had them all killed, then the same caliber of weapons could later be identified to the possibility of the silencers, which is in the newspaper today. Another important point is that the psychiatrist Chris Hatcher, Hatcher, from Langley Porter, meets all the survivors. He works with 30 or 40 of what they call the frightened survivors. He works at Langley Porter Clinic in San Francisco, a branch of the University of California that has been named over and over again for its mind control experiments of the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department. Whenever violence comes down, in comes Chris Hatcher from Langley Porter Institute, who works with these people. Richard Clark, who led 18 people out of the jungle on this 25-mile trek at the time all the others were killed, is asking for police protection. Why? Because he had enough savvy, like the goon squads, the 120 or that, to get his ass out of there. And he's afraid that Jim Jones' son, Stephen, will murder him. Stephen is in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and Mr. Clark has asked for protection because the conditions were, if anyone went down there, they all had to be killed. And also, everybody who set it up eventually will be murdered. And I imagine that'll also be Tim Stone and Terry Buford and the others. But right now, they have to be in control. If they knew about the setting up the banks with 14 to 16 or 20 million in Switzerland, Panama, France, and all over Trinidad and in Georgetown, if they were responsible for setting up these banks, they also can arrange the protection of these killers to wipe out those people that have any evidence of the CIA connections to Jonestown. Jackie Spears said that the Al and Jeannie Mills were wonderful people. They put their life on the line. They said they would be killed. They wrote their book about 6 years with God. They left the church after their daughter received 75 spankings, paddles with wood, and the father had to watch because she had dated a former member of the People's Temple, and they publicly whipped her. There is a lot of talk that Al and Jeannie Mills weren't the Mr. and Mrs. Innocent, that they were very much part of the people that set up People's Temple and worked with Tim Stone and set up the creation that later involved all of their murders and forced Leo Ryan to go down there, even sacrificing Tim Stone's own 6-year-old son. There's reason to believe that that's true. One of the reasons is that there was a lawsuit that the Mills had against Jim Jones. They gave him pieces of property up in Mendocino, 2 houses. Then they gave him income property in Richmond, California, and other property. And at the time of their death, they owned a nursing home, a large piece of grounds with old people that they took care of. But there's never been any mention on how the Mills accrued all this money that they donated to Jim Jones. They gave him this property. Jim collected property from a lot of people. They later sued him. The lawsuit was dropped. Tim Stone moved in with them. Tim Stone was a DA, assistant DA on the grand jury up in Mendocino. He was assistant DA down in San Francisco. He worked close with Joe Freitas, the district attorney, and they have tentacles. He went to Stanford Law School and Stanford Research. There's a doctor from Stanford that was involved with supplying the medicine to Jonestown, the drugs and medicine. And the Mills were very close to Tim Stone, and they set up the nucleus of this experimental farm down in Guyana. And it would be similar to the money coming from Germany down to Colonial Dignidad that supports it being ciphered there. If Colonial Dignidad is opened up and exploded for what it is, then it may be that everyone in Germany involved would be killed. That's why I think that the Human Freedom Center I believed in Berkeley was a CIA front, and I believe the hit squads will kill anybody who talks about what went on. The Langley Porter doctors and so forth are very close to the Central Intelligence Agency. Right after the Guyana massacre, this Dr. Hatcher from the CIA from Langley Porter was asked by George Moscone, who was mayor of San Francisco, to look into the Jonestown story. And then, of course, there were rumors that Moscone was number 1 on the hit list. Mills' family was maybe number 2 on the hit list, and Moscone died a few days later. There's a man in the Bay Area who says that Dan White was a member of the Jonestown group, and that this was an assassination killing of Moscone. So if he's working with Hatcher, who is taking the defectors and brainwashing them and controlling them so they don't talk, then the Mills were killed not because they were exposing Jim Jones, because after they set up the combustion, like an arson, this huge combustion of death, they were instrumental in forming Jones in the beginning, and that is the important part, the beginning of the formation that they and Tim Stone were very much a part of from the beginning of Jim Jones when he came home from Brazil and really began his operation with welfare people and drug addicts and former prisoners. And then the land was leased down in Guyana, and people were shipped off. This entourage of the 128 white programmed assassins that are out, or the 40 or so people who are out, work with the Central Intelligence Agency, work with the military and the CIA, and they're scary as hell. For those of you who don't remember, I met Mrs. Bouquet in the Bay Area in Leo Ryan's office right after her son was murdered and Leo Ryan was dead, and Mr. Harris was there, and his wife had her throat cut, and his 2 daughters had their throats cut, and a stepdaughter down in Georgetown, so that they lost members of their family. But they brought with them a member of the Green Beret, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the military, and they interrogated me, and it was in Joe Holsinger's office with Leo Ryan, and Holsinger was in such a state of shock, he actually walked out of the room. If he had stayed there and listened to what I was saying to those people who were really Nazi dogs, working with Tim Stone and his outer entourage, he would realize who set up Jonestown, and that is the important thing, who set this up. But in the meantime, the primary witnesses are being killed, just as they were killed continuously from the time John Kennedy was killed until tomorrow and the next day and the next day. The primary witnesses will continuously be killed as investigations surface. When they're not being formed, it's okay to let them survive. As soon as committees are formed or there's recommendations to Congress, then the primary witnesses have to be killed off again. That's what I was telling the students in Santa Catalina at the same night that the Mills were being killed. I don't trust the Freedom Center. It's a group of people that I believe are linked to the assassination squads who got their ass out so fast that they're survivors, and all they do is huddle together so that they won't be killed off in case they have to go to committees, because when people talk, just as the informers in a New Mexico jail, when you get 33 informers, you wipe them out. And these informers also will be killed if they expose anything about Jones. Now, what the Mills wrote in their book, 6 Years with God, was all the craziness of Jim Jones and the fraudulence of the place and the religion and the phony things and the whippings and the sicknesses of Jones, but not how it was formed, how they paid for property, who bought the property in Mendocino that the Mills gave to them, who bought their income property in San Francisco. You know, it's been pretty hard to make a buck the last 5 or 10 years, and these people are giving 4 parcels of property, income property to Jim Jones and dropping suits and leaving there, not wanting their money, and Stone leaving his child and down in Guyana, not pursuing it. These are pretty treacherous things. You might ask, would Tim Stone let his own 6-year-old be murdered? In that case that I was just talking about at the beginning of the tape, this Letelier case of organized crime, they told the father to go in and shoot his own son, and after the son was shot, in order to save his life, Peter's life, he said, put the gun in my hands with the fingerprints, and I'll confess that I shot Peter. And they wouldn't let him. He stood over the body saying a prayer, and they gunned him down and left him for dead. But he was willing to say he killed his own son, and he was even willing, they asked him to go in the other room and kill his own son. So when you do this with grown men, can you do it with 6-year-old boys to hide an entire government operation? You sure as hell can. They do, and they did. And that's what Sweeney Todd was saying. That's what Stephen Sondheim was saying in The Demon Barber of Fleet Street. We're not way back in those days. We're right here in 1980, and it's happening all the time. I'll do more on the Mills killing later and on that story, but I believe they were killed because Congress and Leo Ryans, Joe Holsinger, and others are saying, look, you knew, you CIA worked with Jones, and you worked with Burnham, and I believe the Mills family were part of that operation that set up and got Jim Jones going. They were known racists. They were described as elitists. The people in Jim Jones' organizations hated what they called niggers. They ran the place. The white people ran it. The white people escaped. And a few of them have to be killed, just as William Harvey and Sheffield Edwards or Thomas Karamazine or even J. Edgar Hoover, William Sullivan. Members of the white team get killed. The ones that organize it, finance it. If the investigation's too hot, they get killed like anybody else. Well, I did want to get back. I promised you that I'd do Colonial Dignidad, the Charles Krause story. I want to correct it. It was February the 10th, 1980, not February the 11th. The time is out. I didn't think I would run short. I wanted to get to Abscam and the Colonial Dignidad assassination teams, but I'll have to leave that for next week. It's better, I think, to update some of these dates and names, because they may not mean much to you now, but they may, and they're interlocking, and they are events that are happening in front of our eyes, and they just slide through so fast that we have to catch them. And next week, hopefully, I'll do a tape going back to Colonial Dignidad, Jonestown, and Abscam. And the scandalous story, Abscam is for real. It's reaching the highest echelon of narcotics and organized crime. Save every article you can have on it. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel. We'll do more on those on next week, I promise.